Thanks for the intro, Dan. And thanks for organizing the event. So I'm Pierce. I'm one of the co-founders of Ember, and Ember is the world's first 100% electric long-distance bus operator. So I launched Ember with my co-founder Keith. We launched our first service in last October. It's not the best time to launch during COVID, but a kind of interesting opportunity to get started. And we'd been working on the company for about a year before that. Both Keith and I, our background was in tech. We'd been working at a fintech company in London together. So we kind of came at this with no transport experience, no mobility experience, to use the kind of jargon. And I think it was kind of an interesting shift, because in fintech, what we had been doing is really going up against kind of established banks which hadn't embraced technology and were not particularly customer centric. I think we saw something quite similar in the bus industry and the transport industry. It just hadn't kept up with technological change, and that's where we felt there was a sort of an opportunity there. Just to give you kind of one example of this, there's still loads of buses out there that don't have proper live GPS tracking. So if I'm waiting for my bus and I kind of check on my phone, there's just no information about it. And if you compare that to something like Uber, where every single taxi, every car has sort of live tracking and you can see it moving towards you, that's kind of just not good enough. And these buses, they cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. It's not a complicated thing to add GPS, but it does require sort of tech to be embedded, I guess, in the organization. And even where you've seen this in the bus industry, it's often just not been implemented very well. So things are 2 minutes out of date, or you're standing at your bus stop and it tells you your bus is there and it's not there. So that was kind of one angle of where we felt that the sort of public transport, and specifically the bus industry, I guess needed some change, and there was some opportunity there coming from a tech background. And then the second angle of why we went into this is around reducing emissions and electrification. So if you look at the UK, almost all the emissions reduction over the past sort of 20 years has been due to the cleaning of electricity. So basically the rise of renewables, the shift away from coal. The emissions from transport have barely changed at all. It's pretty much flatlined. There's been more efficient cars, but at the same time, people have moved to bigger cars, which kind of neutralize that. There's something like 2% of buses are electric. It's still very, very small. There's not been a massive change in railways electrification. So yeah, if you look at a kind of goal like 2045 or 2050, and you're saying we need to be at zero by then, and that's zero across absolutely everything, then the rate of change in transport at the moment is just not good enough. It needs to kind of get much, much more rapid. And I think the other angle there is that we felt that the technology already existed for a lot of that change to happen today, but people were not embracing it fast enough. They were looking at it in the same way they look at diesel or petrol. And that meant they weren't necessarily seeing the commercial opportunities. They were just seeing this as a sort of additional cost or a hassle, or potentially a PR opportunity, not as a way that business should be done all the time. Specifically around long distance buses, we decided to go into that market because no one was talking about electrifying long distance buses. Everyone would just look at electric vehicles and say, my bus does 500 miles a day. There's no way that can go electric. The range isn't good enough. And we sort of wanted to challenge that and say, actually, if you plan the operations and you have the right technology, you can do that by using things like smart charging throughout the day to really make the most of electric vehicles. And not only that, but if you manage to replace your long distance diesel bus with an electric bus, your fuel saving will be much, much bigger there, because you're using so much fuel because you're driving so far. So practically, we launched our first service from Dundee to Edinburgh last October. We're running with 2 buses, and each of these buses is averaging over 800 kilometers per day. We're pretty sure these are the highest mileage electric vehicles in the world. We're already at about 150,000 kilometers per bus just since October. And we get this mileage by having an ultra fast charger located in central Dundee. Every single time we get back to Dundee, we're plugging it in, charging at full speed, letting passengers on, letting drivers take a break, and then heading out again. And that kind of sounds simple, and in some ways it is, but it's quite a shift in the mentality from a traditional bus operator. So a traditional bus operator has a depot. Often the depot is kind of quite far out of town or not particularly accessible. You would never have passengers go to your depot. And that depot probably doesn't have a high power electricity connection. It takes quite a long time to sort of get all these things worked out. And then their timetables, which often don't change for sort of years at a time, the timetables don't have any time built into them for things like charging. And then the final thing that we're doing kind of differently is we have tracking of every single charging session, the battery at every single day. We can compare battery usage to wind conditions. So yesterday, for instance, we used much more battery than we'll use today because the wind was stronger yesterday. And with all of that planning, we can get really, really precise at making sure we have the vehicles available for every route, but also not leaving loads of slack time. So we are actually getting the most out of those vehicles. The result of this is that we're saving about 500 liters of diesel per day just between two vehicles, about 200,000 liters per year. And also we're offering a great passenger service. So it's the only zero emission public transport from Dundee to Edinburgh. It's also the most affordable thing. We think electric vehicles can actually reduce costs of public transport and make it competitive with cars. We offer things like free cancellation, comfortable seats, lots of legroom, USB charging, bike spaces. Electric vehicles don't have to be a kind of second best option. Passengers actually prefer them. We've got fast Wi-Fi and live tracking, all for free. So yeah, that's a sort of summary of what we're offering today. The next steps for Ember, we really want to sort of expand our routes across Scotland, build a route network. So we've received some funding to help us get another 10 buses over the next year or so. That's Scottish government funding. So that's a sort of key reason in a way that we've been in Scotland, is that kind of the funding mechanism is much stronger in Scotland. It also doesn't subsidize diesel in the same way that diesel is subsidized for bus operators in England. We are building out a charging network. So this charging network is what we need to run our own services across the country. Every other bus operator is typically looking at just installing chargers in their home depot. So they can't run services sort of across the country. It's quite a different thing. And then we're looking to make these chargers available to other bus operators, coach operators, let's say a tour coach or something. A tour coach can't get into any existing car charging infrastructure. So that needs to exist in the future, and they need guaranteed availability, high-speed charging, and so on. And with these new buses, we're going to be increasing the frequency on our Dundee to Edinburgh service, as well as launching some new routes across Scotland. That includes across to Glasgow, up to Fort William, down to Dunbar. So we've got quite a lot of ambitions there. And then finally, we're just going to keep on working on improving the customer experience, taking a kind of tech-led perspective on this. Really, things like connecting our buses with other transport. So at the final mile, imagine you get into Dundee and you can seamlessly just transition to a bike share, for instance, with the new electric bikes in Dundee. Or you can switch to another bus operator or switch to the tram, and they can all be on one ticket. So that's something we're going to spend quite a lot of time over the coming year on. Yeah, so that's a kind of summary. Thanks.